Think back to last night, or maybe this morning. At some point recently, you opened your refrigerator, pulled out a container of leftovers, and without giving it a second thought, you reheated it and ate it. Maybe it was rice from dinner 2 nights ago. Maybe it was some chicken you had cooked in bulk for the week. Maybe it was that big batch of sautéed spinach you prepared on Sunday and have been working through since. Completely normal, completely routine. Something millions of people do every single day without the slightest hesitation. And that's exactly what concerns me. My name is Dr. Raymond Caldwell, and I've spent the better part of my professional life studying how the foods we eat interact with our biology, not just in terms of nutrition, but at the molecular level, at the level of chemical reactions that most people never hear about, because that information tends to stay locked inside research papers and academic conferences rather than making its way into the conversations that actually matter, the ones happening in kitchens, at dinner tables, in the everyday decisions people make about what goes into their bodies. What I want to talk to you about today is something that sits at the intersection of food science, biochemistry, and long-term health risk. Specifically, I want to walk you through 4 foods that undergo genuinely dangerous chemical transformations when they are reheated. Not dangerous in a theoretical or speculative sense. Dangerous in the sense that peer-reviewed research, major health organizations, and decades of food science have documented what happens inside these foods when heat is applied a second time. And the findings are not something any informed person would want to ignore. I want to be clear about something from the start. This is not about fear-mongering. This is not about convincing you that your kitchen is a hazard zone or that eating leftovers will inevitably harm you. What this is about is giving you accurate, evidence-based information so that when you make decisions about how you prepare and consume your food, those decisions are genuinely informed rather than simply habitual. There's a meaningful difference between those two things, and that difference compounds over a lifetime of meals. Stay with me through all 4 of these, because the last one on the list is the one that surprises people most, and in many ways, it may carry the most significant implications for long-term health. Let's begin with something so ordinary, so completely embedded in daily life across virtually every culture on Earth, that most people would never think to question it. We're talking about rice. Cooked rice is one of the most commonly reheated foods in existence. People cook large batches, store them in the refrigerator, and pull from that supply throughout the week. It feels efficient. It feels practical. And on the surface, there seems to be nothing remotely concerning about it. But here's what's actually happening inside the container sitting in your fridge. When rice is cooked and then allowed to cool, it creates an environment that is remarkably hospitable to a particular type of bacteria. This organism produces spores as part of its survival mechanism, and those spores are specifically designed to endure conditions that would destroy most other bacteria, including heat. When you take that stored rice and apply heat to it again, whether in a microwave, on a stovetop, or in an oven, the temperature is typically sufficient to kill the active bacteria themselves. But the toxins that those bacteria produced during the storage period, those survive. Heat does not neutralize them. They remain chemically intact and biologically active in the food you're about to consume. When those toxins enter your digestive system, they can trigger acute gastrointestinal distress. Nausea, cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea are the most common presentations. But the concern goes beyond a single unpleasant episode. Repeated exposure to these bacterial toxins places a consistent and cumulative burden on your digestive system and your immune response over time. There's also a separate mechanism at work that operates independently of the bacterial issue. When cooked rice is cooled, the starch molecules undergo a structural reorganization. This process fundamentally alters the way those starches behave when reheated, particularly when reheated unevenly, as tends to happen in a microwave where heat distribution is notoriously inconsistent. The result is a food that has been chemically altered from what it was when it first came off the stove, and not in ways that benefit the person eating it. If you eat rice regularly and you want to include leftovers in your routine, the safest approach is to cool it immediately after cooking, store it at the correct refrigeration temperature, consume it within a very short window, and treat it as a one-time reheat at most. Cycling the same batch of rice through multiple rounds of cooling and reheating is where the risk profile becomes genuinely problematic. Now let's move to the second food. And this one tends to land harder because it's not just present in most people's weekly meal routine, it's actively promoted as a cornerstone of healthy eating. We're talking about cooked chicken that has been stored and then reheated. The protein question is where this conversation begins. Chicken is a protein-dense food, and that protein density is part of what makes reheating it chemically significant. When protein-rich foods are exposed to high heat, the molecular bonds within those proteins break apart in a process called denaturation. A certain degree of this is unavoidable and necessary during initial cooking. But when you take chicken that has already been through that process and subject it to high heat again, especially the kind of intense, concentrated heat generated inside a microwave, the proteins continue to break down and reorganize in ways that go beyond what happened the first time. The more significant concern, however, and this is where the research becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss, is the formation of specific chemical compounds that occur when cooked meat is reheated. Compounds known as heterocyclic amines and nitroso compounds have been identified in studies examining what happens to cooked and reheated meat products. These are not trace curiosities. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which operates under the World Health Organization, has classified processed and overheated meat products based on the evidence surrounding these compounds. The classification reflects not a theoretical risk, but a determination based on sufficient accumulated evidence. If your weekly routine involves cooking a large batch of chicken at the beginning of the week and reheating portions throughout the days that follow, you are regularly consuming food that has been through this chemical process repeatedly. The cumulative nature of that exposure is not something that can be neutralized by the fact that chicken is otherwise a nutritious food. The two things are simultaneously true, and acknowledging both of them is what informed eating looks like. The practical adjustment here doesn't have to be dramatic. Eating cold, cooked chicken, adding it to salads, wrapping it in greens, incorporating it into cold preparations rather than sending it through another round of heat, preserves far more of its nutritional integrity and eliminates the chemical concern entirely. The third food is the one that, in my experience, generates the most genuine surprise because it involves something that most health-conscious people consider among the best choices they can make. We're talking about spinach and other leafy green vegetables that have been cooked and then stored for reheating. Spinach, in its raw or freshly cooked form, is genuinely excellent for you. The iron content, the folate, the antioxidant profile, the range of vitamins present, all of it represents real, meaningful nutritional value. Nobody is disputing that. But what happens to spinach after it has been cooked and then subjected to heat a second time is a different matter entirely, and the chemistry behind it has been studied extensively. Spinach belongs to a category of vegetables that are naturally high in nitrates. In their natural state, those nitrates are not inherently harmful. Your body actually uses certain nitrate-derived compounds for beneficial physiological functions. The problem begins at the moment heat is applied to the spinach the first time, because that heat initiates a bacterial conversion process on the leaves that transforms the natural nitrates into nitrites. This conversion continues during storage. By the time you pull that cooked spinach out of the refrigerator and heat it again, the nitrite concentration is substantially higher than it was immediately after initial cooking. Under high heat, those nitrites undergo a further transformation and convert into a class of compounds called nitrosamines. This is where the research becomes clinically significant and frankly sobering. Nitrosamines are among the most extensively studied carcinogenic compounds in food science. They have been directly associated in large-scale epidemiological research with elevated risk of cancers affecting the stomach, the colorectal region, and the esophagus. The European Food Safety Authority has issued specific guidance addressing the reheating of nitrate-rich vegetables, citing this exact chemical pathway as the basis for concern. What makes this particularly relevant to modern eating habits is the widespread practice of batch cooking vegetables. Preparing a large quantity of cooked spinach or similar greens at the beginning of the week and reheating portions throughout the days that follow feels like a healthy and efficient approach to nutrition. And the intention behind it genuinely is healthy. But each cycle of reheating compounds the problem. Each additional exposure to heat increases the nitrosamine content of the food. The vegetable that you're eating by Thursday bears a very different chemical profile than the one you cooked on Sunday evening, and that difference matters. If leafy greens are a regular part of your diet, continue eating them. They deserve to be a regular part of your diet. But eat them raw, blend them into cold preparations, or consume them immediately after cooking while the chemistry is still clean. That single adjustment eliminates the concern entirely while preserving every nutritional benefit. And now we arrive at the fourth food, the one I promised would catch you off guard, and the one that in my clinical experience genuinely does surprise most people when they understand what the science actually says. We're talking about eggs, specifically cooked eggs that have been stored and then reheated. Eggs are, nutritionally speaking, one of the most complete foods in existence. The protein quality is exceptional. The fat profile includes beneficial compounds. The vitamin and mineral content is broad and meaningful. There is a reason eggs have been a central part of human nutrition across virtually every culture throughout recorded history. None of that is in question. What is in question is what happens to that extraordinary nutritional profile when a cooked egg is subjected to heat a second time, particularly at the temperatures generated inside a microwave. The proteins in eggs are among the most heat-sensitive of any food. During initial cooking, those proteins undergo coagulation, setting into the familiar solid form we associate with a cooked egg. That process involves significant molecular change. When you take that already transformed protein and expose it to high heat again, the molecular breakdown continues. The proteins fragment further, and in doing so, they generate compounds called oxidized cholesterol byproducts. This is an important distinction that often gets lost in casual conversations about dietary cholesterol. The cholesterol naturally present in eggs, in its unaltered state, is not the same threat to cardiovascular health that was once assumed. The research on that has evolved substantially and continues to evolve. But oxidized cholesterol, cholesterol that has been chemically altered through repeated heat exposure, is a different substance with a different biological behavior. It has been studied in the context of arterial inflammation, cardiovascular damage, and more recently in research examining its potential role in promoting certain cellular changes associated with tumor development. These are not minor footnotes in obscure journals. They represent a growing body of evidence that deserves to be taken seriously. Beyond the oxidized cholesterol concern, there is the straightforward matter of nutritional destruction. The specific vitamins and compounds that make eggs worth eating in the first place are degraded by repeated high heat exposure. By the time a reheated egg reaches your plate, a meaningful portion of the nutritional value you were counting on has already been lost. There is also a food safety dimension that compounds the concern. Eggs are among the higher-risk foods when it comes to bacterial contamination, and the conditions under which bacteria can proliferate in improperly stored eggs are well documented. Combining a potential bacterial risk with the chemical changes introduced by reheating creates a risk profile that no one in the field of food safety would characterize as acceptable. If you prepare eggs in advance for convenience during the week, which is an entirely understandable approach to busy modern life, consider consuming them cold or at room temperature rather than reheating them. Hard-boiled eggs work well in salads and cold preparations. Sliced cold egg adds protein to a meal without requiring any additional heat. The convenience you're looking for doesn't have to come at the cost of introducing chemical changes you could easily avoid. The thread that runs through all four of these foods is worth naming explicitly because it's the principle that makes all of this actionable rather than just alarming. Rice, chicken, leafy greens, and eggs are all foods that are genuinely nutritious and entirely appropriate choices when prepared and consumed thoughtfully. The risk in each case doesn't come from the food itself. It comes from a specific practice that most people engage in without awareness, namely the application of heat to a food that has already been cooked and stored, triggering chemical transformations that either generate harmful compounds, amplify bacterial toxins, or degrade the nutritional integrity of the food in documented and measurable ways. The practical principle that reduces exposure across all four of these categories is simpler than it might seem. Cook fresh whenever your schedule allows it. When you do prepare food in advance, be deliberate about which items you reheat and which you find cold preparation methods for. Store everything properly and immediately after cooking. And treat any reheating as a single, one-time event rather than a repeating cycle. That last point alone, the commitment to never reheating any food more than once, removes a substantial portion of the risk that accumulates quietly over years of habitual eating. Your daily food choices are not isolated events. They are a pattern that plays out across thousands of meals over the course of a lifetime. And that pattern has a relationship with your long-term health that is direct and measurable. Small, informed adjustments made consistently over time produce real and meaningful outcomes. That is not a claim about any single meal. It is a statement about what informed daily choices look like when they are maintained over the long arc of a life.